Hello and welcome. I'm Patrick Curtis, your host and chief monkey, and this is the Wall Street Oasis podcast. Join me as I talk to some of the community's most successful and inspirational members to gain valuable insight into different career paths and life in general. Let's get to it. In this episode, we learn how Gerard left college early to go pursue a professional hockey career in Europe, find out how he broke into Colombia almost 5 years later, why he was so behind for finance recruiting, and how he got his first break at Citi in equity research, only to jump 5 months later to Point72 as a research analyst. Listen to hear why he made the jump to a startup called Hivecell and what they're up to now. Enjoy. Gerard, welcome to the Wall Street Oasis podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So if you could just give the listeners a short summary of your bio. I know you've done a lot of stuff, but just kind of a 30-second to 2-minute spiel would be great.
Sure. It's eclectic to say the least. Left college early to go play professional hockey. Retired after 5 years. Went back to school to finish my education. Came out of Colombia as a 29-year-old man, which was a different experience to say the least. Had a lot of catching up to do on the career front and found myself highly focused on accumulating as many skills as I could over the coming years in order to, again, play catch up. And so I started off in hedge fund accounting at Citi, migrated over to equity research, which then landed me from the sell side, and then I went to the buy side. And then once I was on the buy side, the world opened up to me with all the different types of roles and opportunities that exist there beyond just being a portfolio manager and an analyst, and culminated most recently in my seat at Millennium, where I was on the equities management team, overseeing roughly about 30 portfolio teams and their research process, research technology, hiring, pretty much day-to-day operations.
Very cool. And then what was your latest? Yeah. What was
the
next
step?
And
then there's that, right? I decided to early 2020, which is just perfect timing, pack up what would have otherwise been a career-long seat at Millennium, and left to go help run a tech startup. So I'm currently at a edge computing startup called Hivecell. We're on the COO, CFO of the business.
Awesome. Super exciting. So let's go all the way back to undergrad. You were at University of Vermont. Are you a New England native, Canadian? What's going on?
I grew up on Long Island. My accent is a healthy mix between Long Island, Boston, and Canadian, with virtually no Long Island in there, which is great. I think a lot of people, if there was one accent that I think everybody just generally hates, it's Long Island accents. And so I've been able to disassociate myself with that. But yeah, I grew up on Long Island, played locally, both junior hockey and high school hockey, and was fortunate enough to get a full academic and athletic scholarship to the University of Vermont to play hockey there.
So tell me a little bit about the progression as you're kind of, you're there for the full 3 years.
I was there for 3 years. And then I had a really interesting experience where in between my junior and senior year, I went over on a European hockey tour. What people don't realize, and they shouldn't, is that professional hockey over in Europe starts early. And so there was an opportunity to go over with a few of my other buddies that were at Northeastern and Harvard and a few other schools, and play professional teams to get ready for my own season. And at the end of the trip, I got offered a contract and basically called home and basically said to send the rest of my clothes over.
That's awesome. So you were what, 20 years old, 21?
I was just about to, I was 20 years old at the time.
And so tell me, can you share what that contract was, or who, like, how much they pay you?
Oh God, no. It wasn't enough to pay a speeding ticket. Let's put it that much.
Just enough to live, basically, like 10 grand, like 20 grand for the year, or 50 grand for the year.
Yeah. And they gave you a house, they gave you a car.
So why take that?
You only get to live once, right? Like I felt I felt confident in myself, right? To say, um, school, education, job, workflow, all of that is, I have the rest of my life to do that. My body is as young as it and strong as it will ever be right now. And I felt confident in at the time what I was gonna or about to try and do. Um, and wanted to basically just put my mind towards one thing, right? Because at that time at school, right, school is undoubtedly a distraction, especially if you're on a full scholarship. There's demands in terms of certain GPAs and things of that nature. And at the time, I just felt like if there was ever a time to give it a go, it would be then and now.
For sure. Yeah. So where in Europe were you?
I was in Berlin, and so I looking back on I consider myself a pretty introspective person. I was very immature at 20. And I
like most of us.
yeah, I recognized about myself and felt like getting thrown. I'll tell you the story when I ended up signing the contract and we were in a completely different city, right? And so my coach at the time literally dropped me off at the train station, gave me €100, and was like, "Good luck," and that was it. Like I was I didn't speak a lick of German, right? I didn't know where I was geographically speaking. I knew this new coach that I was about to go play for was going to pick me up at the, Bahnhof, whatever, in the middle of Berlin. And that was it. That was it. And it was grow up time. Right. And so yeah. I look back fondly on that time because I realized that I needed that to grow up.
Was there any inkling at that point of finance or anything like that? Or it was very much just hockey? Hockey was life and life was hockey.
Life. Yeah, I think it was that. But in the back of my mind, one of the stipulations of me doing this was, promising my mom I would go back to college and get my education. And I had, at that point, always had an affinity towards numbers. And, my dad was on Wall Street for 30 years or whatever. So
what did he do?
So he was he worked at like Kidder Peabody back in the day. He worked at Lehman Brothers.
Cool.
He was an operations guy, execution guy.
Very cool.
He was handling global execution for Lehman Brothers and for Kidder.
Awesome. So you were in the hockey world for almost 5 years, four and a half plus years.
Yeah.
Tell me how that all progressed. So it sounds like you were kind of getting some traction, to hang around that long.
Sure.
So yeah, you were back in the U.S. You played, I think, in the minor leagues of the Canadians and the Predators.
I played a little bit in the American Hockey League and primarily in the East Coast Hockey League. So effectively AAA and AA baseball for people who don't understand the levels of hockey.
Yeah, what's your thought process in terms of just how crazy difficult it is to make it to the NHL?
It's nuts.
It's nuts, right?
Yeah, and there's like it's funny you think you're good and then you play against those guys and you're just like, right. And it got to the point, like, it was so obvious to me that, that relative to my skills, relative to my age, because at that point, the NHL had hockey in general had changed. It was at that cusp of getting younger and younger and younger, mm-hmm. and people not having as long of a career. And so the idea of using my mind to make money just felt like, again, I always had this, I call it a quiet cockiness about myself. I thought I could do it, right? I thought I could, now was the time to actually use what I considered I was good at, which was, critically thinking and going from there.
So how did you even get into Columbia?
Brute force.
Yeah, tell me how that works, because you go from a University of Vermont, and makes sense. To go to Columbia. It was a great trade.
Yeah. So it was funny. I'll never forget it. I was sitting at it was my cousin's wedding weekend. Very fortunate. I come from a family where my uncles were incredibly successful. One of them's an orthopedic surgeon down in Florida, and I remember sitting and having a beer with him. And he was asking me what I was going to do. He was interested in, what the next phase of my life was going to be. And I was like, I'm just going to go back to UVM. And I had a year left, and my scholarship persisted even though I left.
Oh, okay.
And they held it for me, which was incredibly nice of them. And so my uncle, I'll never forget it. My uncle looked at me. He was just like, "You're an idiot." like, what are you doing? He's like, you have life experience that classrooms would pay for, that universities would pay for. And he's like, I would call Princeton, I would call Harvard, I would call Yale, I would call Columbia, and tell them your story.
And by the way, you couldn't play hockey there, could you? Because you'd
No,
been pro.
I had already.
You'd be like crushing people.
I didn't. Yeah, the thing was though is I didn't even want to at that point. Like,
yeah.
When I look back on my life, I was never just a student, right? I always had distractions. I was always and now
no, yeah,
for
I
the
get
first
it.
time in my life.
I was just teasing, but yeah.
But I'll tell you a story about when I got to Columbia. So I unbeknownst to my uncle, I only went to Columbia. I only called up there, and Columbia has this really interesting program called the School of General Studies, which was built and designed for World War II vets coming back from war to reacclimate them into society. So it was this idea of a non-traditional student being put into a traditional college atmosphere, and allowing their life experience to drive their educational curiosity and things of that nature. It's a really, really, really unique program that was really defined by the previous what are they called? Heads of the school. This gentleman by the name of Peter On, phenomenal human, and so when I got there, I just realized that, like, this was my chance to sit at the front of the classroom. This was my chance to, and I just found new and unique ways to learn. But it was, when I say brute force, it was, I met with everybody in the admissions department. I met with teachers, I met with faculty, I met with alumni. And at a certain point, it was just like, all right, let the kid in already, right? Like, it was just like, can somebody stop him from coming to school, like unannounced?
Yeah.
And that was it. I had one track mind, which makes sense, right? It was, I was just being myself.
Were you thinking Columbia just because of New York, being near the financial?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So you weren't interested in going to like Princeton or whatnot, or you would have probably gone there, but it was more like Columbia was where you wanted and you just focused on that.
That's it.
You think that really played a role, just harassing all the admissions people? Like
100%. Because again, my when I left UVM,
how did you sweet talk them? How did you do it? Like, I know you said persistence, but was there like, I mean, you can't, like, eventually they're like calling the cops on you if you're too crazy.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think I had a story to tell, right? And, I've been, and this applies to jobs. This applies to, I think, just generally speaking, right? You have to look at your resume three-dimensionally, right? If you don't, then all you are is a piece of paper. I remember one of my buddies was telling me, he was 2 years out of business school. He was responsible for the recruiting for the Columbia Business School at, I think it was one of the big banks. And this guy's boss walked in, true story, walked in, grabbed half the resumes, threw them in the garbage, and said, I don't want to hire anybody that's unlucky anymore. Quote unquote. Quote unquote.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget hearing that, because it just makes you realize that when you drop your resume into those random boxes, right? Resume drops, the odds of you getting that job are almost zero, right? Unless you have some way of making that piece of paper come to life. And so the way I saw that working was, I sent in my resume, I sent in my application, and then I made sure people knew that when they opened my application, there was a huge story. Like, I was a three-dimensional person to them.
Right.
And because there's so much nuance to everybody's life, it's so hard to find some way on your resume to, whether it be for a job or a school or whatever, to articulate all of the context and all the meat behind who you are. Right.
But how did you even get them to give you the time of day? Like, how did you actually, did you
go in?
I
showed up in a coat and tie and just waited till somebody talked to me.
And so who were you able to talk to? Head of admissions?
I talked to the dean of admissions and then pretty much every one of his underlings. Because
awesome.
At the end of the day, it was like, I didn't know who was going to open up my application and read it. So I made sure everybody knew who I was.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I love it. I love the tenacity. So tell me a little bit about kind of, so you're finishing up, what is it, almost a year or two there?
Yeah, I was finishing up a year or two there.
And then how are you thinking about things? Are you immediately starting to look into finance type roles, equity
Yeah,
research
I
stuff?
was, and I was wildly educated. Underprepared for understanding what it meant to get an internship, how to get that internship.
Which is surprising given how tenacious you were to get into Columbia, like how it's the same skill set, right?
It was actually a function of timing, right? Because I started my first semester at Columbia in January, like in the spring semester. And so everybody by that time, I was late to the game. And then I look back on it and I was ignorant too. I didn't know how to prepare for the interviews that I even got, right? I'll never forget sitting down with the recruiter from Citi talking about corporate finance. And he was like, so which department of corporate finance do you want to go into? And I'll never forget responding to him and be like, well, can you tell me more, right, about each one of these things? And he was like, no, you were supposed to research this. And I was like, oh, that's how this works, right? Yikes. I didn't read that piece of advice yet. So
you were still kind of floating. You were still kind of a young, in terms of job interview skills, you were still a young kid.
Yeah, I had virtually none.
So is that why you kind of ended up in accounting, right? That's you ended up with.
Yeah.
How'd you get that job even?
So at the time, my dad was working at Citi hedge fund accounting. Like he had, been partially retired, and like most guys that work in Wall Street for 30 years, they have, in his opinion, a world of, a lifetime of experiences that, these, new fund accountants or whomever operations guys just don't have, right? Because my dad was doing it before computers.
Right? Yeah.
And nice. So my dad had to do all of like the reconciliations of a bank by hand with his team, right? Yeah. Trade reconciliations were done 3 or 4 days later, right? Crazy, like you can't even imagine walking out of a bank or a hedge fund now and not having a VAR, right, at the end of every day and closing your books almost every single day. And so my dad had all of this like institutional knowledge. So he was basically doing this on the side a little bit and keeping himself busy. And he introduced me to his counterpart at Citi Hedge Fund Services. I got hired, quite frankly, as a part-time guy, to start with. Mm-hmm. And then, keeping with tradition, just brute force, taught myself, VBA. I taught myself, all the things about Excel. I taught myself about, all the different just accounting aspects of stocks and derivatives and all that kind of stuff. And, the biggest thing for me was just this recognition of like, well, where does this end, right? Does this end, like having this knowledge base, does this end in a really good place? And the answer was no, right? Like I didn't want to be in the back office, right?
So how did you manage to make the transition to equity research? That's a super tough transition.
It's internally. Actually, yeah, it's pretty funny. Hockey's a very small world. And so at the time I was coaching in this youth hockey organization up in Merrimack. And the guy that was running the program, this phenomenal guy, but he was also in a small detail in this guy. He used to be Aerosmith's road manager.
That's pretty cool. Okay.
So I've had beers with this guy probably 3 or 4 times in my life. I've never heard him tell the same story twice. Like just the best person to go out to drinks with. Awesome. And so I called him. I called him one day. I was like, "Hey, Rich, it's been a while since I caught up with you. Like, I'd love to drive up and see you after practice or whatever." He's like, "Listen, I just started a new business. I have no time." He's like, "In 2 minutes, tell me what you're doing." At the time, I was at Citi, so I called him. I was like, I'm at Citi, I'm doing this. He's like, I got this guy. He's like, you got to call this guy, John Rogers, who unbeknownst to me was the head of equity research at Citi.
Mm-hmm.
Big hockey fan and all these kinds of things. And so he was like, I told John you're calling him, give him a call when you can. And so I called John. I was like, John, this is Gerard. Rich told me to call you. He's like, what are you doing right now? I was like, nothing actually. He's like, there's a shuttle from Jersey City over to 388 Greenwich, leaving in like 15 minutes. He's like, get over here. I'm like, okay. So I jump on the shuttle. I come over, and no word of a lie, he went and met me across the street from 388. We talked for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and he was like, you want to work in equity research? I was like, sure. He's like, all right, wait right here. And he went back into 388 and grabbed, like, one by one, grabbed a bunch of different analysts that were trying to hire junior research associates. And I eventually stumbled on somebody there, and it just worked out. And I ended up walking away that day with basically an equity research job that I wasn't fully prepared for.
So he was pulling people out to kind of interview like analysts and from
that's exactly right. Like it was
Were
like
you better? Dating. Were you more prepared at that point? Like, how did you even say you want to do equity research? You were a little more prepared.
I was a bit more prepared. I had a good buddy that had just left there, again, a hockey guy. So he had prepared me to some degree because I knew I was going to end up in this place at some point. I just didn't realize it was going to be that day.
Right. It moves fast sometimes, right? So why such a short stint there? Tell me what happened that another opportunity came knocking. Tell me how that happened to switch to the buy side.
Yeah, it was very fortuitous. Again,
because it was 5 months at Citi, right? Or even less.
Yeah, it was like 6 months in equity research. And I got a buddy of mine called out of nowhere. He was like, hey, listen, we're starting this new group at Point72. It's, a fundamental research group, and we're doing all these things. And my boss loves hockey players and their mentalities. And, would you want to come interview? And I'm certainly not going to name names or speak ill of what was going maybe at the time at Citi, but it just wasn't working out with me and the analyst that I was working for at the time. This
why do you think that is? Just unrealistic expectations? Were you just too green and taking a while to get up the learning curve? What are you honestly looking back at it?
It was completely misaligned expectations.
Okay.
Very different. It was what I wanted to be doing, what I thought they were going to teach me to do was just completely different than what I was doing.
I like unpacking that because this happens a lot to people where they kind of jump into a role they think they want. It happened to me. I went to private equity, got fired, and within 3 months, it sounds like you have found a better opportunity, and that's why you jumped. But for me, it was like just very different going banking, where they're like telling you when you can go to the bathroom, to private equity, they're like didn't talk to you for like, and like you just had to know what to do. And for me, it was like a super tough transition. I wonder, was there any of that kind of when you jumped to equity research from like an operations role, or was it more just
no, it was this analyst had just a very different opinion of what I should be doing. And it had nothing to do with equity research. I thought I would be touching stocks. I thought I would be, looking at balance sheets, writing reports, at least listening on company calls. And it was like, no, you haven't earned that. And so you're going to do this for
a hazing. It's just a hazing culture.
You're going to do this until I tell you you're better than, until you're allowed to do this.
Right.
And it was tough because I think that person in particular was just very incongruent with the other analysts that I had run into at Citi. It was an interesting time in my life, to say the least.
So you were actively looking, or you just?
I don't think happened? I was. It just happened.
Just happened. Okay.
I would love to attribute it to divine intervention, to say the least.
Okay, so Point72 comes calling. You of course say yes. It's interesting. Do you mind talking about like operations paid equity research, then to the buy side, what the jumps were? I assume they were all pay raises. Yeah, they were. From operations to equity research, it was probably I earned twice as much. It's like 50 to 100 or something.
Yeah, something like that. And then And then from sell side to buy side, it was probably an additional 20 or 30%.
That sounds about okay. That's what I would guess. A few years out of school. Okay, so you're there. How is it different? Is it better? Are you actually doing stocks and doing research or no?
Yeah, I was doing research. It was here that I started recognizing the value of data. I think that and the organizations, right? Again, when I got to Point72, that was the time where I realized that wow, there's more to hedge funds than just being a portfolio analyst or a portfolio manager or an analyst, right? There's all you mean you can do business development and hire people. That's pretty cool. You could do
Those are a whole data analytics team, probably,
yeah,
right?
there's a
Yeah.
whole data analytics team that was being built at the time. A lot of different venues. You just kind of had to get there, right? And then you had to keep it, right? You couldn't be an idiot. Um, but then you also realize stuff about yourself. Like I realized very quickly, one of the core reasons why I think I was generally unhappy at that time in my life was because I was stuck behind a computer screen, right?
Yeah.
I'm by definition an extrovert, right? And so um, sitting behind a computer screen, typing research notes or working on an Excel model is like my hand starts to shake, right? Because you're not fulfilling like a primal piece of yourself that if you ignore that for a long enough period of time, it becomes really unhealthy. Which
So did you recognize that back then? You say you're pretty introspective. Did you recognize
yeah,
it back at the time?
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what were you thinking? Like, what's the next step? How did you even go? You're like, uh-oh, like I'm down this equity research or this research path.
Yeah.
I should be in sales or whatnot or
No,
someone.
it was more about like at that time I understood what a research process looked like, right? I could talk stocks with people, right? Still remained to be seen whether or not I could actually deploy capital or things like that. But again, I didn't want that stress. I didn't want that for myself,
Yeah.
right? And so I was fortunate to stay in touch with somebody who I worked with at Point72 that worked at Citadel. And he moved over there, and then another person within at the time Surveyor, they were looking to build out the business development team, and found myself with an opportunity to finally be out in front of people, talking to people, interviewing people. But the other aspect of it too is like I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I can say that wholeheartedly. But what I was cognizant of is how do I go build up very effectively mutually exclusive skill sets, right? So I had worked with accounting, right? I had worked with equity research at this point.
You even taught yourself some VBA.
Yeah, I taught myself a little bit VBA, just enough to be dangerous.
Yeah.
I've since forgotten all of it, which
Yeah.
is what it is. And then when I saw the opportunity at Citadel, it really was okay. How do I understand a portfolio construction research process? How do I tie that all together? How do I start to figure out who's full of shit and who's not? Excuse my language.
That's fine.
And
so this job at Surveyor, that came up. This business analyst, this business development.
yeah,
What exactly that mean? Like day to day? So you said you're interviewing, so you're working with HR to interview people. Or like what do you?
well,
What are you
no, I
doing?
was working directly with the portfolio teams, right? Understanding, was it coverage that was missing, right? If it was coverage, what type of skill set, what type of whatever, and then it was cultivating relationships, or at least attempting to, across the buy side in order to, see and inevitably interview talent and draw them away and draw them to Surveyor. But it was also as much about learning the technology that existed within Citadel.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think my time at Citadel only reinforced what was slowly becoming something that I was drawn to, which was how do you take in data, right? How do you interpret it, and how do you do that in a scalable, repeatable way so that you become introspective about your research process, uncovering bias and in your construct and how you trade and all these kinds of things. And so I found myself more and more involved with how do I take the relationships that I had now built with the portfolio teams, right? And how do I now, recognizing that there was the portfolio teams at Surveyor to some degree were underrepresented from an education standpoint with the technology that existed within Citadel more broadly.
Mm-hmm.
How do I go learn that technology and bring it to the teams to bring out the efficiencies and things of that nature that, quite frankly, Citadel labored over. But the way that Surveyor had been built and brought up, opened up the there was just this disconnect with the technology.
How should the listeners think about the connection between Citadel and Surveyor? Because for those that don't know.
Yeah, so Citadel's long-short equity business began and started with Global Equities, which is their flagship long-short equity brand.
Mm-hmm.
Surveyor started as a new way of deploying capital for them. So it started off as something called Pioneer Path, which was effectively a fund of funds at the time, right? So they would seed managers outside the building. And then I think it was right around 2008 when their ability to control the decisions of these portfolio managers outside the four walls of Citadel became a problem. So Surveyor served as a way to suck in all of this talent and all the capital that they had deployed, put them underneath the Citadel, technology stack and trading and then it just took a little bit of time to figure out who was the right portfolio manager that would succeed in this methodology.
Mm-hmm.
And undoubtedly that was there was a gentleman there by the name of Mark Hansen who was basically the third hire at Surveyor and basically hired every single portfolio manager over time. Great mentor to me. Really good guy.
Awesome. So you were there for a good 3 years. So it was a nice run. So
yeah,
should I think of your role there almost as you're like a conduit between the mothership and Surveyor, or is there
No, I was at the time I was reporting directly to the COO of Surveyor.
Got it.
And there was a transition period there where I was doing a lot of business development stuff at the beginning, the first half of my tenure there, and then the second half was
business development. Be more specific.
The hiring, and
okay.
Yep. And then internally, my last year and a half there was deploying the technology. So learning the technology and then bringing it to the portfolio teams and hopefully enhancing their process to some degree.
Got it. So you're there for a good 3 years. Why jump?
I felt like there was, in hindsight, when you look at Millennium, I didn't know as much about Millennium as I grew to and truly appreciated once I had gotten there. Nothing short of an incredible business that Izzy's built.
You give the listeners who don't know Millennium well, just a quick summary.
Yeah, so Millennium has been around since 1989. It really is a platform by every definition, right? So they have all of these, trading and back office and everything. They apply all of that to every portfolio manager that they bring on. They give you capital, you do your business, and it's just a meritocracy. It's very straightforward. You get paid out every year exactly what you made, right? But there's all of these nuances to that, right? It means that you have to produce, right?
Yeah.
And so there's
sink or swim. It's very sink or swim culture.
It's a sink or swim, and it previously, before I got there, the idea of the equities business was very hands off, right? It was almost each portfolio team was their own effective business. They ran their own hiring, they ran their own, portfolio analytics. They did all these.
Everyone's doing different technology stacks all around for every single one. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And so
they brought you in to try and get some best practices across the board, or?
Well, they they brought my boss in to do that, and then my boss hired me to help execute it. And so
Got it.
I was very fortunate to get hired by a gentleman by the name of Mike Ferrucci, who, to this day remains one of the more influential guys in my life. Just the professionalism, the way he conducted himself, I remain eternally grateful for the opportunity. But he came in with this completely radical idea of, well, why don't we help the teams? Right? We get to see across 60 portfolio teams, we get to have some of the best portfolio managers on the street. Well, why don't we spend incrementally more time with each one of those portfolio managers, understand best practices, and then effectively distribute those best practices more broadly across the entire effectively portfolio of human capital. And then the assumption would be that everybody would benefit, right? And so one of the key pieces that I was fortunate to help work on was really this this portfolio dashboard, this portfolio optimizer, all these things, these tools that historically each one of these portfolio teams was doing slightly different. And so when it came time to analyzing their book, both from a management level, but also their own level, the consistency of that data mattered, right?
Yeah.
And so we spent an inordinate amount of time stabilizing and scaling the calculations in such a way that regardless of who you were, right, you would go into the tool and this column and this row meant this for everybody. So you had this incredible apples to apples comparison across the entire portfolio, and the incremental changes that came as a result of seeing that truly gave Pete Santoro, who's the head of equities there, a completely new view on the business and how it's truly the pulse of the business, right? We really saw it as that.
That's awesome. So tell me about the latest opportunity and the jump there and the excitement around Hivecell. And then we can call it, because I know you got to leave soon. So
yeah. So Hivecell, again, falling in line with this idea of data and how people use it. It's one thing for a portfolio manager to use their trading data one way. That's easy. That's centralized, right? There are truly decentralized problems that businesses in general are facing. Like anything, there's patterns, right, that happen in most industries. And in the case of compute, there have been really 4 big pendulum swings, right, from a centralization to a decentralization back and forth. So the first one was obviously to the mainframe, right? Then it was to the personal computer, right? Now it went back to the cloud. And now what we're seeing is that there's a momentum building back towards decentralization, towards this something called edge computing. And this idea of putting compute power as close to the raw data as possible, because there's a proliferation of sensors and IoT, Internet of Things related data.
Yeah.
And there's not a great way of processing all of that information. And so what we're finding is a lot of the companies we deal with at the margin are having to compromise which data sets they choose to analyze in order to come to the conclusions that they think they have to. Our argument is acquire it all, right? We're a data acquisition story. We're a last mile of compute story. We're an edge computing story. So we're all of these things, right? Depending upon who you talk to, and the flavor of the problem that you're trying to solve. And so that's where. So I was fortunate to meet the CEO of the company 6 years ago while I was at Point72. He and I have stayed in touch over the years. I became a personal investor in the business in 2019. And then after a pretty sizable seed investment from Mellanox, which is now NVIDIA, he offered me a job at the end of 2019, which at the time sounded like just the best idea, right? We had all of these proof of values that were going out with like Coke Industries and NBC Universal. The world was fine. What's this virus? Blah, blah, blah. And, I'll never forget, just incrementally every day, because I had a 3-month notice period at Millennium. So from the time I quit to the time I started,
the world fell apart.
Yeah, the world literally fell apart. My first day on the job was March 16th, right?
Oh my
last year.
My birthday was March 14th. My 40th birthday was, and there was a party. We had like the last hurrah, and like half the people canceled, and it was like,
Yeah,
it was like the last get together before everyone was like the whole world shut down.
yeah. It's a hell of a way to go out, right?
Yeah,
But
just under the wire.
but no, we got when I look back, I would make the same decisions all over again. I think I'm one of the lucky ones. I found myself in just one of my coaches always used to describe luck as like operation meets preparation meets opportunity,
Right. Yeah.
And so having gone back to business school a little while, like in 2014, one of the core questions that my CEO asked me when he was trying to challenge me to come over here was, he was like, I don't think you went to business school to be running an equities management team. It doesn't sound congruent. I think that there's an entrepreneur in there somewhere. And if I can pull that out of you, I think you're going to see the world in a completely different way. And I couldn't help but that nagged at me for weeks. And he turned out to be right. I think there was a huge learning curve, right? I came here as the COO, and within 4 months got promoted to the CFO or took on the CFO title because I had to, right? I just had to move and shake. Like I had to go get, an SBA loan to supply the business with capital. I had to, build the financial model. I had to re-architect all of our accounting and chart of accounts. I had to figure out our new banking. And there was no time like today to finish that stuff because there was a sense of urgency I'd never felt before, especially since, retiring from hockey. And listen, here we are. We just, we raised $4.5 million in the middle of last year, in the middle of the pandemic, which was, I consider a pretty good success, right?
Yeah.
And then we just
congrats on that, by the way. I didn't think we talked since then.
No, thank you. And then I was just able to get a lead investor for our $20 million Series A. So we'll be closing that here in the next month or two, which is exciting.
Super exciting.
Yeah.
Gerard, thanks so much for sharing your story. Any last or final words of wisdom, kind of looking back at your whole career so far?
Yeah.
I know there's still a long way to go, but.
Yeah, I think it really is, to me, it's all about being flexible and kind of letting go, right? Letting go of expectations of yourself, letting go of expectations of what this job is supposed to be for you at whatever. It's all going to serve a purpose, right? And even if you're, at this very moment, somewhat unhappy with where you are career-wise, there's blessings in disguise all over the place. And they're usually in the form of new and unique skill sets, new and unique opportunities that if you're willing to put your hand up and take them, you might never know where you might otherwise be, right? And so, and then just work, like the idea of work ethic is something that, hockey ingrained in me. Like, as I was saying earlier, this idea of brute force, everything in my life is about brute force, right? Yeah. Control what you can control. And to that degree, if you can control more, right? Because then all of the ambiguity, all the probability, all the statistics go out the window and you control 100% of your outcome or your destiny or your goal.
Or close to it.
Close to it, right?
Yeah.
And then, the other part of this too is this willingness to fail, right? Failure is not as bad as everybody says it is. It's usually if you're willing to look inside of yourself about why it didn't go the way you expected to, why you failed. You get to learn so much about yourself, and the incremental step you take towards whatever you're supposed to be doing is a lot clearer if you're willing to go through that, introspective exercise.
I love it. Let's end on some introspection.
Yes.
Thanks, man. Really appreciate it.
It's so good to see you. And like I said, I'm anybody that I'm now an advisor with you guys, and so if there's any way that I can help both you and your listeners, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm more than happy to do what I can for the sake of the class of people that you're trying to reach.
Appreciate that. Yeah, Gerard can be found in our mentor area of the site. Definitely check them out. And we'll also we'll put this podcast up on the site, and we'll link to your mentor profile as well there.
Amazing.
So people can find you easier. Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
All right.
And thanks to you, my listeners at Wall Street Oasis. If you have any suggestions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to send them my way, Patrick at wallstreetoasis.com. Until next time.